Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this Earth Chatter Earth Day webinar. It's such a pleasure to be able to welcome you all to today's webinar. It's actually quite a different way for us to organize Earth Day, given the fact that we are all in different situations, but experiencing the same crisis of the pandemic. Um, I want to thank you for being here and joining us today and send you warm greetings from Costa Rica. We are here located at our Earth Child Education Center on the campus of the University for Peace. And we wanted really not to miss the opportunity of doing something about Earth Day and celebrate that 50 years ago, a number of people joined to organize this idea around the Earth Day. And around that time, 50 years ago, 1970, it seems that 20 million people mobilized for the first Earth Day, demanding a new way forward. So we could say that many things have changed since then. And we could say that with a combination of due to a combination of various efforts around that time, in addition to Earth Day, such as the publication of the Silent Spring book of Rachel Carson, the Club of Rome report on the limits of growth, and the UN Stockholm Conference on Human Environment, many things evolved in terms of elevating the importance of environment in our mindsets and in the political arena. But we could also agree that efforts to take humans to a higher level of understanding, of consciousness, of our human Earth, human nature interdependence, such as the Earth Day and the Earth Charter movement, has never been more urgent than now. So for the past 20 years, the Earth Charter movement has been inspiring and engaging people to expand their awareness and understanding regarding our interconnectedness with other people in the large living world. And the emphasis of our work has been on the values and principles that can guide humanity towards a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world. And the slogan that we chose this year to celebrate the 20th anniversary of since the launch of the Earth Charter is turning conscience into action for a thriving Earth. And we have selected this slogan precisely because we want to demystify the thinking that values and ethics, such as the ones articulated in the Earth Charter, are abstract and have nothing to do with real life. So there are many people who see no value in addressing the values and ethics that should guide our behavior and decisions, and therefore do not see the importance of instruments and movements such as the Earth Charter, which is there to offer a guide, a map, an ethical compass for humanity to guide us towards a more just and sustainable world. So since the beginning of the year, of this year, we have planned the year in a different way, and the coronavirus pandemic came. We all have been experiencing this pandemic crisis in different ways. And this is the sort of storm that is shaking all regions of the world in different levels. And that is making us probably, I hope, it's making us see with new eyes our vulnerability and the vulnerability of our systems. But I also hope, and well, I guess we hope that this current crisis will show the strength of human capacity to come together and collaborate. But I would say that every one of us, we seem to be wondering when all of this will be over. What are the causes of this current crisis? How do they relate to other crises? We have been wondering, how could we prevent something like this to happen again? And what will happen after this current crisis? So we have been wondering, I guess all of us from our homes. Some studies are saying that these may become we may experience more frequent events such as this one if we do not change many things in our behavior and decisions, I would say worldviews and mindsets. But I certainly hope this pandemic will somehow generate a new path to a better world. So for today, we organized this webinar in a sort of a dialogue to offer space for all of us to reflect on worldviews, system thinking, and values in the planetary phase of human civilization. But thinking about this during and beyond the pandemic. And for today, for this dialogue, we have invited and have the pleasure to have here today with us Fritjof Capra and Sam Crowell. That I invite both of them to come. They are going to give us some brief introduction on the overall theme. So Fritjof Capra is a physicist and a system theorist. He's the founding director of the Center for Ecoliteracy in Berkeley, California. And he wrote many books, such as The Web of Life. And the latest book he wrote is this one, The System's View of Life. Maybe many of you have, A Unifying Vision. And Fritjof has a course that is around this latest book that he has. And we also have the pleasure to invite here and to join us today to share some of his reflection, Sam Crowell. Sam is Professor Emeritus of Education at the California State University, San Bernardino, and he's former director at the Center for Research and Integrative Learning and Teaching. He has written also several books. The first one I saw was The Reenchanting of Learning many years ago. And his latest book, Sam Crowell's co-wrote a book called Emergent Teaching. I invite also all of you to take a look. So both Fritjof Capra and Sam Crowell are involved in the Earth Charter movement for many years. Sam is facilitating one of the courses on transformative learning that our Earth Charter Center for Education for Sustainable Development offers. We are here in Costa Rica, based on the campus of the University for Peace, and we host a UNESCO chair on education for sustainable development with the Earth Charter. But most of our courses are, of course, or have been actually for years already online. So let me first invite Sam to come to the floor and offer some brief reflections on the theme of today. Thank you, Sam.
Are you there, Mirian?
Yes, I'm here and I can
I've lost my video, Jake, so I've something as here
we can hear you.
Oh, that's good.
And maybe we can put on the video. Yes.
Here we are. I'm sorry
Welcome,
for that glitch. And thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm very honored to share this time with Fritjof and with Mirian and with all of the participants who are here. It's a real pleasure. And I want to begin by acknowledging that this is a special day. It's Earth Day, and it's a real opportunity for us all to reconnect with the planet Earth, to honor it as our home. This is one of the critical elements, I think, and one of the critical ideas that's expressed by the Earth Charter, that planet Earth is our home. And just as in this time of pandemic, we're staying at home, we are caring for our home because we know that it's part of our sustainability and our own well-being. I hope we can extend this as a culture and as society to the planet Earth itself. I want to also acknowledge that the indigenous and aboriginal peoples of the world, and the messages that they continue to send us in their language and in their perspective and points of view. The Lakota use the word matakuyasan to refer to all our relations, our relatedness to the world. It's an ancient systems view, if you will. And as we think about our relationships and our relationship with the earth, with the species and communities of life, may we acknowledge and honor them. The Anayumia people have a term, wado, salahiliga wado, to be grateful and to give honor and thanks for the life that that it nurtures us and that is a part of us and runs through us in our daily existence. So I want to acknowledge those peoples and for the history and what they've passed down to us. I also want to acknowledge you and thank you for being a part of this. And I hope that rather than just being a listener, you'll activate your imagination, your own ideas, and tie those to your own experiences. I honor your language, your culture, your place and communities, your families and your ancestry, and the force and possibilities of your life. So thank you for being a part of this. And thank you. I look forward to interacting through this medium to learn more about your ideas and your questions. For myself, I've long seen education as a cultural project, one that's fundamentally tied to the metaphors of a culture and its worldview. And when a worldview is no longer adequate for the times, it's no longer adequate for the science that we know or the values that are needed, the social institutions around this begin to struggle and falter. And the larger consequences will continue to be felt throughout the planet. When this worldview, when this perspective, when this perceptual notion of what is real, when it's inadequate, when it's forced into a mechanical and a rote sort of perspective, then it can't open up to the possibilities of complexity. It can't open up to the relatedness because it's captured itself in these isolated blocks of separateness. And what we know is that the world is not separate. It's unified, it's whole, and it's interrelated and interconnected. We see this right now in this global pandemic, that it's very hard to isolate one issue or one problem or one aspect of our situatedness. The world is connected in ways that we just can't imagine. And we're part of that connectedness. So the complexity is one aspect of our experience, but we're part of that. And because we're connected, what we do and what we think and how we act has value. It's not isolated. It's always making a difference. So I often say to my students when they say, what can I as one person do to make a difference? From a systems perspective, you can't not make a difference because everything that you do and even think and the energy that flows through you is affecting the world around us. Just we don't know how that happens and what the final results will be. So our culture and our metaculture, our societies are struggling to break away, I think, from an outdated and insufficient and inadequate worldview. And in a way, a systems view of life can return us to a more enchanted relationship with the earth, not only with the earth, but with one another and with ourselves. And I tried to capture this sensitivity, it's a sensibility in one of my books, The Reenchantment of Learning. And it's basically that through our experience with working with change is when we have a different sort of view of the world, then we start to apply that to the practical situations of our life. And in my experience of working with change and reform, I've noticed that unless there's a shift in the way we perceive the world, there won't be a substantive shift in the way we act in that world. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of these explorations with you, learning from your questions, learning from Fritjof, and as we move forward in the next hour or so, to really look at what this shift in perspective, what this shift in the way we view the world can mean to how we act upon it, to the future of the planet and to the future of humanity. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's always good to hear you and your reflections on worldviews and connections. Let me now invite Fritjof Capra to turn on his camera and mic and share with us some of his reflections on worldviews, system thinking, and values in this planetary phase of human civilization. Fritjof.
Hello, Mirian, and hello, Sam. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this event. And hello, everybody who is listening to us. Greetings from my home in Berkeley, California. We have much to celebrate on this 50th anniversary of Earth Day. But today, our celebratory mood is overshadowed by the COVID pandemic, which has resulted in massive disruptions of our daily lives with multiple impacts that are likely to lead to profound political and social transformations. I would like to present a brief systemic analysis of the COVID-19 crisis, which means an analysis that shows how all its dimensions and its aspects are interrelated, as Sam has already emphasized. In my view, the coronavirus must be seen as a biological response of Gaia, our living planet, to the ecological and social emergency that humanity has brought upon itself. During the last decades of the 20th century, we have exceeded the Earth's carrying capacity, and the irrational obsession of our political and corporate leaders with perpetual economic and corporate growth has generated a multifaceted existential crisis threatening humanity's very survival. Scientists and environmental activists have warned of the dire consequences of our unsustainable social, economic, and political systems for decades. But until now, our corporate and political leaders, unable to break their intoxication with financial profits and political power, have stubbornly resisted these warnings. Focusing their attention on short-term political and economic fluctuations, they disregarded the impending long-term catastrophic consequences. Now, however, our political and financial elites are forced to pay attention, as COVID-19 brought the earlier warnings into real time. The clear-cutting of large areas of tropical rainforest by multinational food corporations, as well as massive intrusions into other ecosystems around the world, have fragmented these systems and have fractured the web of life. One of the many consequences of these destructive actions was that viruses, which had lived in symbiosis with certain animal species, jumped from those species to humans, where they were highly toxic or deadly. In the 1960s, the HIV virus jumped from a rare species of monkeys in West Africa to humans. And this year in 2020, the coronavirus jumped from a species of bats to humans in China, from where it rapidly spread around the world. Population density is a key variable in the spread of COVID-19. And population density is often a consequence of excessive profit maximizing, whether on giant cruise ships or in other forms of mass tourism, in giant supermarkets and department stores, or in crowded living situations caused by social and economic inequality. In previous times, these vulnerable social and cultural conditions were usually concealed. But now the coronavirus, which does not know any social or cultural boundaries, has laid them open. When the pandemic spread around the world, one country after another went into lockdown with only essential businesses remaining open. And most people were confined to their homes, as we still are. As a consequence, transportation of people and goods decreased dramatically, supply chains were disrupted, businesses closed, the stock market collapsed, and unemployment soared. So the worldwide health crisis has gone hand in hand with the worldwide economic crisis. Both of these crises have led to widespread tragic consequences for individuals and communities around the world. However, from the perspective of Mother Earth, there have also been many positive consequences. As automobile traffic and industrial activities decreased dramatically, the pollution of major cities around the world suddenly disappeared, and we are once again enjoying clear skies and clean air. On the beaches of Brazil, critically endangered sea turtles are now hatching in a stress-free environment, undisturbed by tourists. As giant cruise ships no longer enter the Venetian lagoon and other tourists stay at home, the canals in Venice have become so clear that fish can be seen again. In India, residents of Punjab are now able to enjoy a stunning view of a mountain chain of the Himalayas 200 kilometers away, which they had not seen in 30 years. The coronavirus has already been more effective in reducing CO2 emissions and slowing down climate breakdown than all the world's policy initiatives combined. Now, this does not mean that we want to continue in the current situation, but the world's COVID-19 response has shown us what is possible when people realize that their lives are at stake, either individually during the pandemic or as civilization as a whole in the climate emergency. We now know that the world is able to respond with urgency and coherence once the political will has been aroused. With COVID-19, Gaia has presented us with valuable life-saving lessons. The question is, will humanity heed those lessons? Will we shift from undifferentiated extractive economic growth to regenerative qualitative growth? Will we replace fossil fuels by renewable energy sources for all our energy needs? Will we replace our centralized, energy-intensive system of industrial agriculture with organic, community-oriented, and regenerative farming? We have the knowledge and the technologies to embark on all those initiatives. Will we have the political will? And will we be guided by the ethical principles expounded so beautifully in the Earth Charter? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind, to quote Bob Dylan. However, what we are seeing already is that corresponding social policies, which were unthinkable just a couple of months ago, are now being discussed seriously in various countries. For example, Denmark plans to pay 75% of the salaries lost by employees in private companies to help them through the crisis. Similarly, the UK is planning to cover 80% of salaries. The idea of a basic universal income, long considered a fringe idea, is now being discussed in several countries. Spain is nationalizing its private hospitals. California is leasing hotels to shelter homeless people during the pandemic. If we can catalyze global leadership to continue such social policies, and if we can add to them the policies that respect and cooperate with nature's inherent ability to sustain life, we may not only overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, but also succeed in restoring the Earth's ecosystems and stabilizing the climate. Looking back on 2020, future historians may conclude that even though COVID-19 had widespread tragic consequences for countless individuals and communities, in the long run, it may have saved humanity and large parts of the Earth's community of life from extinction. That would indeed be the cause for joyous celebrations on future Earth Days. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fritjof. It's very good to hear you, as always, and for giving us some inspiration towards the future. I liked very much the fact that you said or reaffirmed that the health crisis and economic crisis, we have bad results out of all this pandemic, but from the nature perspective, the results are actually pretty positive. And we have to see it through those different lenses of what's going on. So let me now go through some of the questions, and I would like to start the first question with Capra. And the first question that we have is, what are the linkages between a healthy planet, healthy people, climate change, and the current pandemic?
Well, as I have explained in my presentation, the pandemic arose out of a severe ecological imbalance, and its impact is so dramatic because of social and economic imbalances. And the two go hand in hand. We see once more that social justice and ecological balance go hand in hand, which is also the central message of the Earth Charter.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. Sam, would you add your own thoughts on this question. What do you think are the linkages between healthy planets and healthy people, climate change and the current pandemic?
I believe one of the linkages that that occurs to me, Mirian, is that there is a sense of universal responsibility. When we look at a healthy planet, healthy people, climate change, we get a notion that because the world is interconnected, then there's a requirement for all of us to take responsibility for who we are, what we do, and how we act. One of the things that I almost prefer the term inescapable responsibility, because we start to realize that that everything that we do has ramifications and has implications for others. We see our social distancing holding us back from greeting someone more closely, and because we don't want to infect someone else or to be infected. So we're starting to realize how close and how intricate our connectivity is. But it's not only individual responsibility that's universal. It's the responsibility for our policies. We're starting to see that our policies make a difference, or the lack of policies. That there's certainly a responsibility on what kinds of policies moving forward are going to make a difference in the health and well-being of this planet, of people, and of our climate. There's also institutional responsibility. Our institutions are trying to gear up, as we can see. Our health systems are sometimes inadequate. So our education systems are under challenge when students are working from home. So what is the institutional responsibility? How can we reframe this responsibility to where it includes a sustainable planet and health and climate change? And then finally, there's also structural responsibility. We're seeing that the structure of our societies are embedded in old ideas that are keeping us from protecting and working and living in harmony with the planet Earth. And so structurally, we need to perhaps stand back and use this time to stop and look and listen and feel the consequences of the world that we've created, and realize, just as Fritjof was beautifully illustrating, how this very pandemic can allow us to reflect on the positive aspects that could happen if we had the will and took responsibility for making it happen.
Now, for both of you to comment, normally in the mindsets of policymakers and people in general, we see climate change as something that is more like related to environmentalists, and it's somewhere there, right? And the policymakers, and I would say the majority of people, see climate change there, the health of people in another place, right? And so therefore, not seeing the connections between the connection between healthy planet, climate change, and people. Do you think that the current situation will help us have a new mindset towards this, the linkages between all of them? This is for both of you.
Well, if I may answer, I do hope so. And, Sam in his presentation emphasized that no single aspect of the pandemic can be isolated. And that, of course, is also true about the climate emergency and about any of our global problems. All our global problems are fundamentally interrelated. They are systemic problems and they need systemic solutions. So everything does hang together. The health of the planet, individual health, social health, and so on.
Good. Thank you, Fritjof. Sam?
I certainly agree, and it seems to me that that there's a need to take a long view, to the broader view, and as we look at climate change, we're looking at part of it is an inner reflection to see, what have I done? What have we done to this planet that nurtures us? And if that sensitivity to honoring and the planet and seeing it as our home isn't there, then we're likely to still feel the illusion of our separateness. But when we start to see how the earth connects itself and wraps its arms around us as well, then perhaps we can also take this broader view and have this imaginary vision that we hold in each of the individual and independent actions that we take. And I think it's like holding on to the core, remaining who we are. And when we see ourselves as part of an interconnected web of life, then and we hold on to that, then the vision and the imagination starts to integrate and embed itself into our very experience and action.
I'm just thinking that our listeners will probably think that Sam and I have scripted our response together because we are just feeding on each other. But I can tell you all that we actually did not meet before this event and did not prepare things together. So it's genuine similarity of thinking. I want to say something, Miriam, about your question about an Earth community worldview that you had.
Sure.
And this is what I call the systems view of life. It is a view of life in terms of relationships, in terms of patterns, in terms of context. And one of the fundamental insights of this systemic understanding of life is that nature sustains life by creating and nurturing communities. Sustainability always involves an entire community. And the ecosystems are such sustainable communities of plants, animals, and microorganisms. And there are valuable lessons we can learn from nature about how to build sustainable human communities. So for me, one of the most important roles of education is to learn these principles of organization or principles of ecology that nature has evolved. And this is what I call becoming ecologically literate.
Ecological literate. Thank you, Fritjof. So there is this important term that is that the Earth capture well, that you rightly said, that goes into this question, the second question, which is around Earth community. So many of us, when in our upbringing, we learn to care for our families, our institutions, our country. That's what we learn, no? When you are in school. And not always we go through a life experience that helps us to expand that image of connectedness and the understanding of what really Earth community means. So in the Earth Charter, this worldview of Earth community is very strongly articulated. And I would like now to give the floor to Sam to expand on that, on what is embedded in this worldview of Earth community and what could be the role of education in cultivating that.
Those are big questions.
They are.
Well, there's a set of phrases in the Earth Charter that I really, really love. And sometimes when I'm working with young people, I love to almost create a chant, a fun chant that energizes these terms. What are we? We are one human family. And where do we live? We are Earth. We're one Earth community. And we share, what do we share? We share a common destiny. So one human family, one earth community that shares a common destiny. That those metaphors of community and family, once we begin to see that those are wrapped up in the whole notion of interconnection, then it starts to create its own imaginary view. So a worldview is how we perceive things and how we look at the world and how we look at ourselves in relation to that world. And so I think this is the challenge, this shift. We are in relation always to that world. Maturana calls it structural coupling. We can't learn anything, we can't be anything without some kind of coupling. We couple with the environment. As we move from one place to another, we're always a part of our environment, and our environment is part of us. And when we see ourselves, when we begin to identify with that notion, that inseparability with our environment, that view of an earth community starts to have more and more power and potency to it. Because the biosphere is interconnected, it's always moving, it's always dynamic, and it's always changing and transitioning. And that means we are always moving and transitioning and changing. So nothing is without that kind of flow and movement and cyclical patterning. I think, again, building on metaphors, the old worldview that we're encased in, all of us, was built on mechanism, on this metaphor of the machine that can be controlled, that is linear, that's sequential, that moves along. And we've put that in education. This has to come before this, and this comes next, and this comes next. Well, nature's not that way. It is non-sequential, it's non-linear, and it's always moving about in ways that are unpredictable. Maybe probabilistic, but unpredictable at the end. And so this idea of mechanism is, when we start to see it in our institutions, in our lives, in our thinking, and the way we look at the world, then it's an opportunity to stop and say, whoa, look what's happening here. Because this newer worldview is one of ourselves and the earth as an organism that's dynamically changing. And nature is holonomic in that sense, because the whole reflects all the parts, and the parts reflect the whole. Just like our DNA gives a whole picture. We can take one cell and have the information of our entire heritage, I suppose is the word. But this nature of the parts and the whole reflecting each other, moving together, creating one another in this dynamic sense of coupling and interaction and exchange of energy. This is key to what we're doing. And what I've tried to do is actually create questions about, what does this mean for education? Not just what we teach, but how we teach it as well. And these things of cyclical patterns, of diversity, of context, of nonlinearity, of emergence, those are really important explorations to have. And I'll end on this. I know I'm taking probably too long. Paul Davies, years ago, identified 9 attributes of living organisms, living systems, I should say. And over the years, I've played with these, trying to say, what does this mean if we were to apply it to building an educational culture that reflected it? These 9 attributes are complexity, that we see the world and we act in the world in a multifaceted way. Self-organization, we're driven to organize our experience, to make meaning and sense of it. Our uniqueness, we are sense that we are agents active agents in the world, and each one of us are unique in that agency. Emergence. Emergence is one of those things where it's a bottom-up information rather than top-down. Apply that to education and see where it takes you. It's a very interesting experience. Holism, unpredictability, openness, interconnection, disequilibrium, in other words, chaos. Chaos is the prerequisite for creativity and co-creativity, evolution, and teleology, or a sense of purpose. So I'm going to stop there because we could play with these for hours and hours to see where they might take us educationally and philosophically, but they're rooted in the science of living systems.
Sam, may I ask you something about the sequential nature of education that you just mentioned, and the fact that nature is highly nonlinear, especially living nature is highly nonlinear. Now, I have this problem whenever I teach, also when I write, but more so when I teach. In my online course, for instance, I start with a first lecture about the nature of systems thinking and the general historical introduction. And this generates a lot of excitement and a lot of questions. And people would say, I'm an architect. What does this mean for architecture? And I say, hey, wait a moment. I first have to lay the groundwork before we get to architecture. But it is natural for people to immediately make connections. How do you deal with that non-linearity and the requirement to speak sequentially? And we do need to teach sequentially, but we also need to combine the non-linearity with the sequential nature of language.
No, I agree entirely, Fritjof. I think what happens is that because we are living systems, we don't automatically think linearly. We think in a very non-linear way. Our brains are making connections everywhere. But then when we organize our thinking, organize that cognitive experience, we linearize it. We put it in a sequence where we can analyze it and understand it and communicate it in a particular way. Instructionally, I find that if I make linear statements, and obviously a discourse or a lecture or whatever, I will pause in between and allow students then to talk about what they've just heard and share the perspectives that they're thinking about. And suddenly there's a nonlinear explosion of ideas much farther and much beyond what I had spoken about. Now we have more that we can do this. And I like the notion of iteration and recursion that comes back around and around and around. So I hold the core understandings that I want to communicate, and at the same time invite multiple perspectives of those understandings to recursively regenerate and take us somewhere that's unforeseen.
I also use non-linear conceptual maps, so-called mind maps. Do you do that?
Yes.
Yeah, that's very useful.
That's a very good technique to capture the non-linearity.
Absolutely, I love those.
So given that we are talking about how to bring all of these into education, it seems that we are entering into a new planetary phase of human civilization. And also we need to figure out ways to further stimulate climate action. And actually climate action was, and I think still is, the main theme of the Earth Day this year, climate action, how to engage people more in climate action. We have been working a lot on education for sustainable development. We have actually, I'm going to just add one question here that comes from the floor, because we have people following us in YouTube, live stream, and in Zoom. And Bruno Maia from Brazil asked the question, could you please talk about the role of education for sustainable development on this process during the COVID pandemic and in the future? So I'm just bringing Bruno Maia's from Brazil question into this question that we already had planned here, which is question 3. And let me start by asking Capra to come and share some thoughts on this question 3.
Well, as we have said already several times in this program, what we need to overcome the COVID epidemic and what we need to overcome the climate emergency is a profound change of ideas and values. And this kind of learning is what is known as transformative learning. And, you know, Sam Crowell has spent his whole professional life on developing and analyzing this transformative learning. So we could have a whole webinar, he and I, you know, discussing the nature of transformative learning, and I hope someday we will. But let me just say that in my own experience, the most powerful way to experience transformative learning is when you experience it in a learning community, and especially when the learning concerns relationships and patterns and emergence. And when you discuss this conceptually and at the same time experience it in the human relationships that are formed in the learning community, that to me is a very powerful way of facilitating transformative learning.
Wonderful, thank you. Sam, what's the role of education in all of these planetary fields? And how do you engage with it?
I guess as I began my thoughts and comments today, I do see education as a cultural project. Education in general has tended to replicate the culture rather than change it. And I think by incorporating a systems view and a systems perspective in what we do and creating cultures around that view, an educational culture, then it becomes a lived reality. And this is something I've been playing with for a while. We can talk about systems, but it's not the same as experiencing systems. We can talk about the Earth Charter principles of care and ecological integrity and social justice, but it's not the same as living it out. And when you create a living culture, and when everything that you do is bound in the languaging and the metaphors and the activity, then one experiences it. There's nothing to teach. I've seen videos of some of the schools in the Ecoliteracy program that Fritjof founded, and the experiences of those young people out working in the gardens and making connections, and both among with the plants and that they're caring for and nurturing, but also with the science behind it and the language behind it and the writing and the community. They experience those things and it doesn't go away. So when we build these, I think part of the role of education is to focus on hearts and minds. And for me, and I think this goes to a next question, that sustainability should be the central purpose of education. And within sustainability, the ethics and values and mindset and perspective of the Earth Charter. So with that being the larger image and vision, then all of the other content areas connect to that. For me, curriculum is a focused conversation over time that keeps wrapping itself around ideas and practices and values and understandings. And so when I'll close on this, there's a quotation by Ray Grigg that I just love. It says, teach only what you understand with your heart, then teach heart to heart, and the world will be changed. And I think that's the essence of what I mean by living these views and living these values out. And to me, the Earth Charter is one of the best guides to hold the larger vision and see individual and community action in the midst of that vision.
Thank you so much. So we could say that education has, of course, an important role to play in this current phase, in all that humanity needs, but not any kind of education. It's kind of a different kind of education, not the more traditional.
Education that is founded on separateness will take us farther and farther away from a system's view. Yes, I think education can harm the environment, because if we keep isolating our subject matter, isolating our experience, isolating and focusing only on information and information processing, then we're not seeing the imagination and the application of a different worldview. So yes, education's critical, but it's the right kind.
We should also say, Miriam, that education today is offered not only in the traditional institutions, schools and universities and professional trainings and so on, but also by alternative organizations. Today we have a worldwide coalition of NGOs, a global civil society, and this global civil society, of which we are part, all three of us are active, play active roles in that civil society, and we have our centers of learning, our research institutes. We have countless online courses and seminars that are separate from the traditional educational institutions.
Yes, yeah, indeed. So let's talk a little bit about roadblocks. What do you think are the major roadblocks to move humanity towards an era of collaboration and human nature harmony? In this current crisis, sometimes we see possibilities of collaboration across borders and cultures and areas of knowledge, and sometimes we see also walls being built. So what do you think are the major roadblocks or challenges to move humanities towards this new era? Can we start with Sam?
Oh, this one's an intimidating question, I think. There are so many roadblocks, but I suppose personally, the one that I focus on most is that sense of worldview. I think the shifting of consciousness, I know that's a vague term, but shifting the way we perceive the world is a prerequisite, I think, almost, not entirely, but part of a prerequisite to substantive change. And in my efforts of educational reform, just in that institution in general, is you can offer all kinds of new methodologies, but they will usually move quickly and then move right back. When you change the assumptions, the fundamental assumptions about what education is and what it's about and how it connects to a larger sense of who we are and the world we live in, then change actually happens quickly. There isn't a particular methodology. As educators, we're practical, we're applied thinkers. And so the question, we always want to practicalize our understandings of the world and of curriculum and of information. So shifting our mindset is, to me, one of the largest obstacles. The other is the word toxic. We're living in a toxic world. The origin of that in the Greek was that it was actually a bow, the word for a bow and arrow. And the arrow was often dipped in poison, and then it was targeted and shot, obviously to destroy and kill. So it's a very alive image to me, that when we begin to look at the toxicity, the obstacles, that often these are targeted. In other words, what are the arrows that we're shooting into our environment? What are the arrows that we're shooting into the social fabric of our society that are poison, that are destructive? And there's a shamanistic dual set of questions that I think addresses this. One is, what pulls you forward like a magnet from the heart? Once we begin to shift our perceptions, what is pulling us forward? It will be different for each one of us, but it will also be the same for each one of us. That which pulls us forward into taking action in the world. And then secondly, what is holding you back? So we have the obstacles, and almost always the obstacles are the limitations of our own thinking, or our own fears, or the lack of looking at that broader view of where we might be able to open possibilities that weren't there.
Thank you, Sam. Fritjof, for you, what are the main obstacles?
I agree very much with Sam, but I want to add also a positive perspective to that, and that is that in the 50 years since the first Earth Day, there has been a lot of progress, there has been a lot of change, the paradigm has shifted in many regions and segments of society. As I said before, we have a very large and powerful global civil society. In the United States, when you look at opinion polls, you find that there are huge majorities for taking climate action, for alleviating economic inequality, for gun control, and so on. And yet nothing is being done. The population wants it by 75%, 80%, 90%, and still the American Congress doesn't do it. And to me, the single most important roadblock there is the obsession of our political and corporate leaders with this illusion of continuing corporate and economic growth. The relentless pursuit of this irrational obsession has given us the utterly corrupt political systems that we find today around the world. So we urgently need a shift from quantitative to qualitative growth, and from corrupt to ethical behavior, which is behavior for the common good.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me now take a few questions that we already have from our participants here. I'll share with both of you two questions first. And so the first one is from Anupan Sarap from India, who is following us from India. Anupan is an expert on system theory also. He's a professor there and a very good friend. So Anupan is asking, most of the responses to overcome the pandemic have come from the community, not organizations. Do you see this as a turning point in our consciousness about our role and abilities to transform our systems ourselves? And I'm gonna actually ask another question already because we have many questions and running out of time. Prior asked, and Flora Kaziraki asked both of you, what is your definition of regeneration? Your definition of regeneration, and then the question of Anupam about, is it a turning point in our consciousness about our role and abilities to transform our system? So who wants to go first?
So Sam, do you want to take the first part and I take the second part?
All right, sure. Although Fritjof wrote a wonderful book called The Turning Point, and many years ago, it's interesting. This sense of community during this time has been very, very powerful, and I think communities began to take responsibility for themselves and each other in a very different way, often in positive ways. And I hope it's a turning point. I think it's interesting that the term community is such an important notion. When we use that term and think about it as a metaphor, just imagine the images, look at the images that come to your mind. What do you think of when you hear the word community? I have a breakfast community, and we meet on Zoom every day. But I also have a larger community, and so what do we mean by community? What's the nature of the things that happen within community? And Maxine Green used to see freedom itself as a responsibility within community. So even the webinar is bringing together community, even though we come from many distant parts of the world. So yes, I do think a turning point, as Fritjof mentioned before, there are a lot of movements and in terms of looking at the world in a more interconnected way, but it has not reached policy. It has not reached our many of our institutional structures. And so I think, but it's out there. It's out there in the populace. It's out there within the everyday lives of our community. It makes sense. There's a common sense within it.
Okay, so let me go and talk about regeneration. At the very core of the systems view of life, we find a new conception of life in terms of networks and in terms of a particular kind of network, and that is a self-generating network. All living systems are organized, self-organized in terms of networks. The connections are network connections, and these living networks continually generate and regenerate themselves. Technically, this is known as the theory of autopoiesis by Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. And the basic lesson to be learned is that nature sustains life by continually regenerating itself. So nowadays, there are many people who say, we don't want to talk about sustainability because they think that means sustaining the status quo. We want to talk about regeneration, but a true understanding of the nature of life shows us that sustainability fundamentally is regenerative. Therefore, a sustainable agriculture is a regenerative agriculture. Or maybe perhaps Sam would say a sustainable education is a regenerative education.
Yes.
Thank you so much. We have a question here from Herman Mulder, who is joining us all the way from the Netherlands. Herman is asking, at this junction of history, or rather of the future, how can we make the Earth Charter principles actionable by governments, business, and civil society?
Well, maybe Mirian, you should answer that yourself.
Yes, you might be the best person.
Well, that's a tough question. I think collaborative processes, strengthening the Earth Charter movement, and working in education in all levels. I think the issue is that when we talk about the word education, people picture schools and universities or children. And I think we need a lot of education of public leaders, hopefully young leaders, in various levels of government, civil society, and business. So unless we, as Sam were saying in Fritjof too, we're able to help people change the mindset, ourselves, including in our worldviews, to embed this view of systemic thinking, integration, and values, it's hard to embed. So I think how to make the Earth Charter principles more actionable is by showing good practices and by investing more and more in various ways of looking at education.
Let me add to this, Miriam, that the COVID pandemic maybe can teach us a good lesson here, because it is commonly understood now by everybody that we can overcome this crisis only with collaborative efforts. We need a coordinating activity from governments, but whether or not we observe this social and physical separation, for instance, and stay at home and wear masks and so on when we go out, that depends on us individually, and it's a collaborative effort. And so our behavior needs to be behavior for the common good. That's the only way to overcome the crisis. But that's also true generally for the climate emergency and the other aspects of our crisis. And behavior for the common good is ethical behavior. And the principles of this ethical behavior are all laid out in the Earth Charter. So the Earth Charter, in this very moment of the pandemic and of the crisis, is an extremely valuable tool for us to practice our behavior for the common good.
If I could add one,
yeah, go ahead.
One thought. In terms of the Earth Charter, I think there's an understanding that organizations and institutions all reflect a set of values, a sense of purpose. And I think it's time to also challenge the values, to say, what are the values that you're working toward here? And are these the ones that we want to move toward in the future? Because our institutions and our organizations all reflect a set of values. And when we begin to question the values that are there and offer other alternatives, as are stated in the Earth Charter, then there's a little pushback. And I think it's time for truth-telling here. The working toward the common good is, if the values that we have are not doing that, then let's challenge them.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a question here from Akpezi. Akpezi is following us through YouTube, and Akpezi is normally in Nigeria or in the UK. And I'm very happy because Akpezi was for many years the head of the environment education program within UNEP. And Akpezi is asking the question, what methodologies exist for shifting the mindset of leaders who are ready to blow up the world if things don't go their way? Of leaders who mismanage their country's resource for selfish ends. So again, methodologies. Are there any methodologies that exist for helping to shift the mindsets of leaders?
I wish I knew.
Yeah, I think they need to be impeached or voted out of office.
Yes.
That's the only way I can see. Yeah. Because they are so egocentric that they don't shift their mindset.
I think I totally agree, and perhaps the new phrase on the Earth Charter, turning conscience into action, participating in the political process, whatever political process that might be in different parts of the world. I think truth-telling, challenging the values, exposing the values that are being put forward. I think all of those, I don't know if I would call them methodologies, but there's certainly commitments that...
Also, getting money out of politics would help enormously, because that's usually what sustains these leaders.
Yes.
That various segments of society profit from them. The famous 1% profit from these political actions, and therefore keep these leaders in power, who work for a tiny minority, but a very wealthy and powerful minority. So ending corruption, getting money out of politics, I think would be maybe the best strategy.
Yeah, I would say we also need more programs that really take seriously education of leaders, to sensitize them, to offer them experiences of connection and sensitization, and understanding of basic ecoliteracy and this notion of connectedness. So unless they go through experience, education, values reflection, looking at the consequences of decisions, and elevating their sense of care and responsibility, unless we do more of that, that is hard, because then the whole focus and emphasis of their work is very much centered into self-interest and national interest. Let me take, yeah.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
So Dominic Starker, thank you, Dominic, for being here with us today. I think many of us know Dominic. Over 10 years ago, he used to be their study coordinator for youth programs. And now he's doing a wonderful work on collaborative learning and leadership. And he's commenting, I'm sensing that some of our discussions on education is still espousing a teacher-learner polarity. If we are all teachers and all learners in our pursuit to live sustainably on planet Earth, what role does generative dialogue play in shifting consciousness and inspiring action? I think the question is on the role of regenerative dialogue.
Well, I'll comment on that, I suppose. Hi, Dominic. It's good to hear your question. And it's a tough question, I think. But no, I think you're right. Most of our conversation this morning has been on teacher-learner roles. And I think as we flatten those roles out, those look very, very different. And one of the things in the book the last book that I had written was basically what happens when learners collaborate and take not control, but take responsibility for what they're doing, and then we bring those together as an active community. The role of the teacher changes, and everyone is a teacher and everyone is a learner, and we experience the world both individually and collectively. It's a beautiful thing to see, and it's certainly a means of generative learning, transformation. My view of transformation basically is that transformation is always happening because it's the nature of organic systems. It's always moving and changing through process. And so our part is to be in the midst of that and go with the transformations that are occurring, give some guidance to it, learn some wisdom from it. So it's a beautiful question.
I think what we experience, and I'm sure Sam will agree with that, is that in our role as teachers, we have worked out certain ideas, certain presentations, certain theories, and we teach them again and again. And every time we teach them, they are improved. And that's the learning, because we have learned from the previous time. We have learned from our students how to say certain things better, how to correct certain errors, certain nuances, and that's the ongoing learning.
Yeah. Olga Bermudez from Colombia. Yeah, she's working at the university there. She's a professor, and of course, an expert in environment education. She's asking you, the question is whether you consider that the coronavirus experience will provide environment education lesson to all of us.
Provide, excuse me?
If this coronavirus pandemic will help or will provide environment education lesson.
Well, I think I really answered that in my presentation, that we can see the ecological regeneration that has happened just in a few weeks. And that's definitely a lesson that we can learn. And it doesn't mean that we need to go on, or we want to go on in this current state of social isolation and distancing, but we can change our behavior, we can change our technologies, we can change our lifestyles, and there are definitely lessons to be learned.
Sam?
I totally agree. I think environmental education is more than learning about the environment, but it is seeing how we are situated within the environment and are a part of it. And so I think looking at the COVID-19 crisis, we began to see that humanity is a major part of the larger environment itself. And so that gets back to Thomas Berry's notion that very little happens in the environment, in the natural world, that isn't influenced now in the coming ages from human choices. And so I believe that human choices are a very integral part of environmental education.
Yeah, absolutely. I think already for everybody who is trying to understand how the pandemic started and how to address it and the consequences of that, we are all already in a process of learning and hopefully in a process of changing our behavior also in many ways, in the way we deal with our day-to-day life. So I think just from the moment that the pandemic started and people reading, looking for reasons why, or the root causes of all of these, the various root causes, I think it's already a lesson. And I want to believe that the world will learn the lesson. Let me bring just one more and last comment from Dominic, which is a comment question. And he says, in my opinion, so that's Dominic Sturker. In my opinion, the Earth Shadow principles are as important as the iterative, consultative process, the consultation process that took place, that co-created the principles of the Earth Charter. How can we continue to embody such dialogue and collaboration in all that we do to ensure that collective intelligence informs collective action? So we do have the intention to engage in ongoing dialogue, about what are the values that are guiding our decisions and behaviors and what they should be. And I think that's an ongoing conversation that took place in terms of understanding, but also listening to one another in terms of how do we understand from our various perspectives these values. So let's maybe Fritjof and Sam answer that.
I think here again, we will see that the COVID crisis is really teaching us not only some valuable lessons, but also some skills, because now there's a whole explosion of interactions, virtual interactions, via Zoom and other platforms. And mostly what we are doing is having dialogues. When we, before the crisis, when we met, we would hang out, we would play tennis together, we would go for drinks, we would make love, we would do all kinds of things that we can't do now. But what we can do now is have dialogues. And so I think it will hone our skills to have dialogues and also our enjoyment of having dialogues. Now, we will go back to doing these other beautiful things that we love, but I hope that we will keep our new skills of engaging in dialogue.
Wonderful. Sam?
That was beautifully said. So I would just add, I'll add the part on the Earth Charter to me is the Earth Charter. I think the beauty of it, as Dominic noted, was the incredible process that was created to come up with these visions, with this collective vision. It was such an open and collaborative process. I think if we look at the Earth Charter only as a set of statements, then we miss the value of the Earth Charter, or the potential value, I should say. And because it's meant to be a dialogue, at least in my thinking. The Earth Charter is an open conversation about the essential values that are really needed in the 21st century. And the action principles are a conversation about how can we put this into the world? How can we bring it forth? And it gives suggestions, it gives ideas, and it gives even some very specific notions, but all of those are meant to be engaged with, struggled through, grappled with, as if you're wrestling. The word grappling, I think, is a wonderful metaphor, because you're holding on and you're struggling a little bit. And I think as you struggle to see, as we struggle to see how to implement these values and understandings and action principles in the world, it's an incredible document for community action and for clarification.
Okay, well, thank you both. We are almost coming to a close. I would like just to acknowledge that we have a lot of people following us on YouTube live stream, and also here in the Zoom platform. We have people from Costa Rica, from the US, of course, Vilma Peña and others from Costa Rica. Song Lee is joining us, Paul Lubers, Peter Blaise Cochran from the US. Of course, we have people from Colombia with Nicolas Bermudez and Olga. Namrata Sharma, who is following us from the US. Mark Hathaway is following us here also from Canada, and Malora Rainer also following us from Canada. We have people from Italy, the Netherlands, Alide Rurik and Dirk van Derven is also following us from the Netherlands, and Herman Mulder, of course. Maria Vilches, who is also one of the facilitators of our online programs. She's following us here through the Zoom from Puerto Rico. So now I really want to thank all of you. Grian Kutanda is also following us from Spain. Heidi Vega is also joining us here today from the National University in Costa Rica. And it's wonderful to have people from various countries, of course, Brazil. I want to thank you all. And I would like just to invite both Sam and Capra to offer any final reflections and remarks briefly. Sam, would you like to start?
Oh boy. Well, I would just like to say thank you, Mirian, for your leadership in putting this together, and your staff, Alicia and others. I've taken so much away from Fritjof Capra's words and thoughts and ideas today and for years. So it's much appreciation. And I would just say, I hope we dream together. And I think the dream is the yet to be that already is. It's a memory waiting to be born in a different place and time, an enchanted reminiscence of who we are. And I think when we go to the roots of who we are, and our relationship with this incredible planet and larger cosmos, we find purpose and meaning in a very special way. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam. Fritjof.
Well, I want to add my thanks to you, Miriam, and the whole, your staff, the whole organization, and my greetings to everybody out there. I recognized several of the names of friends and colleagues. Hello to you all. And I would like to conclude by saying again that the COVID pandemic has shown us dramatically how the Earth can regenerate itself in just a few weeks. Clear skies, clean water, wildlife flourishing. This has happened because of dramatic reductions of human activities, motivated by fear of illness and death. But it can continue with dramatic changes, not reductions, but changes of human activities, motivated by our love for the earth and for the community of life. We have the knowledge and the technologies to make these changes. What we need is political will and leadership at all levels of society.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Fritjof. And I would like to then end this dialogue, this session online we had today to celebrate Earth Day with a little bit of an Earth Charter perspective. So happy Earth Day to all of you. Again, normally we would be celebrating Earth Day in a different way, probably outside, and I invite you all to go outside and maybe connect with nature, even by just feeling the air and the sun. But I would like just to mention that a few days ago, Isabella, my 16-year-old daughter, was just sharing with me over a lunch that she was already thinking how she would be sharing with her children and her grandchildren what happened in 2020, what happened and how the world has shifted. Because her children would be reading that and her grandchildren will be reading that from books of history, and she would have to help them understand this strange situation that the world went through. So thank you all. Happy Earth Day, and let's turn our conscience into action.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.